Thank you, Angela. I want to thank all of you, too, for being here. You know, this conference, I've been to a number of our conferences now, and I'm always pleased to be here, always honored to be here, seeing old friends and meeting new friends, and all for the sake of bringing good Catholic health care to, you know, the many people who need us. And Lord knows in this issue of nutrition and hydration, they need us. And my thoughts for today are going to really center on three issues: the development of Catholic moral teaching in this area, St. John Paul II's allocution on nutrition and hydration, and I also want to highlight some persistent voices to the contrary. And I think it's important that I do that because family members oftentimes, and this is the theme for this conference, is the family. Family members oftentimes are very confused about when is it proper for me to remove food and water from mom or dad? When am I killing them? Am I killing them by doing that? And so we have to really be able to unpack the history for ourselves. I mean, not that our patients and their families are going to want to know that, but we have to really look at it in light of what was our consistent teaching. And after we look at our consistent teaching, well, how do we apply it today? So I'd like to be able to begin with the three people that are really involved in this. One is St. Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century. St. Thomas talked to us about, just want to make sure that I have this right, who taught us that man has an obligation to nourish his own body. And we all know that. In the 18th century, Alphonsus Liguori encapsulated the teaching on ordinary and extraordinary care by defining what these limits are, or as we would call them today, what are the burdens? So part of our discussion today are going to be an assessment of benefits and burdens. He taught us that it's not necessary for one to take expensive medicines or to move to an environment to prolong his or her life, such as moving to Arizona or what have you, if you can't afford it, or for it suffices to make use of ordinary means of treatment. And I will speak to the benefits and burdens later on here. In 1957, addressed to anesthesiologists, Pope Pius XII wrote a watershed document on ordinary and extraordinary care as it pertained to artificial respiration. He stated that one is obligated only to use ordinary means of treatment, not means that would be overly burdensome. He also stated that life and health are temporal realities that are subordinated to spiritual ends. And this is where sometimes our families get a little confused and need us to help move them past that. The Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith further refined Catholic understanding of ordinary and extraordinary care in the Declaration on Euthanasia in 1980. A more precise meaning of these terms are proportionate and disproportionate care. Now, as healthcare professionals, you're all aware of what these words mean, but I find it better to speak in terms of proportionate and disproportionate because it's a lot more concise, if you will. It gives us a better understanding of, you know, when should we take it the next step. Now, ordinary proportionate care refers to people having reasonable hope of benefit, that the patient would have a reasonable hope of benefit without imposing disproportionate burdens. Extraordinary or disproportionate care does not offer reasonable hope of benefit and does not impose disproportionate burdens. Now, I think what's going to be important for us is to look at this term down the road as we go along here about this reasonable hope of benefit, because that's where sometimes the ethicists, some Catholic ethicists, get it a little bit wrong and a little bit confusing. So in 1995, the Pontifical Council for Pastoral Assistance to Healthcare Workers published their Charter for Healthcare Workers in paragraph 120 of which explicitly affirms the administration of food and liquids, even artificially, is part of the normal treatment always due a patient. Their undue interruption can have the meaning of real and true euthanasia. Now, the Vatican put out another revised version, and you can find that in the table for the National Catholic Bioethics Center that could be ordered. And I think that would be helpful for all of us, is to take a look at what their charter is as it stands today. Now, John Paul II and a group of bishops from the United States in 1998 is quite explicit. Nutrition and hydration are to be considered normal care and ordinary means for the preservation of life. It is not acceptable to interrupt them or withhold them, if from that decision the death of the patient will follow. And this would be euthanasia by omission. So basically, John Paul started the process of clamping down on some of the abuses of what nutrition and hydration are considered. It is ordinary, it is normal care, and should not be removed. And we're going to talk later on as to when it is appropriate for us to remove nutrition and hydration. Now, as Catholics, we're not vitalists. It's not life at all costs, and we realize that. As Elias Greccia had written in his text on personalist bioethics, he would state that life is a fundamental value, but not an absolute one. We're subject to death by our fallen nature, and so because of that, there are going to be times when we can allow death to happen. Not cause death to happen, but allow death to happen. And so he continues on in his allocution, Nutrition and Hydration, that it concerns itself with the persons, and he concerns himself with persons in a vegetative state, affirming the intrinsic dignity of these persons. And here's this quote: "I feel the duty to reaffirm strongly that the intrinsic value and personal dignity of every human being do not change, no matter what the concrete circumstances of his or her life. A man, even if seriously ill or disabled, in the exercise of his highest functions, is and always will be a man, and will never become a vegetable or an animal. He affirms that these persons have a basic right to health care, nutrition, hydration, cleanliness, warmth, and to the prevention of complications related to confinement in bed." Now, we saw this in action during the Terri Schiavo case. You remember that case a number of years ago. The woman was not dying. She had full function of her lower brain, which means that she would be able to digest nutrition, she'd be able to defecate, she would menstruate, she would do all those things that people do reflexively and don't have to think about it. But her upper death, brain death, had occurred, and so she wasn't able to think as a human, and she wasn't able to act as a human. And in this instance, the cultural realities that we're living in today says she ceases to exist. I mean, all we have to look is to our philosophical friends in the Enlightenment. When you see René Descartes, what was his words? Cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. And because she wasn't able to think, therefore she was not. She did not exist according to the cultural understanding of things. But we know much differently. We know that that wasn't the case. That soul has not left her body. As Aquinas would put it, the human soul is the animus, the animating force of a person. And so she was still doing those things that persons do. Action follows essence. And so you're not going to be able to do the things that she was able to do if the body and the soul were not together still. And so we got to be really and truly careful about this. And I think sometimes our families are concerned because they just don't know. Part of your job as healthcare providers is to help teach. Part of my job as an ethicist is to help teach, maybe to different people. But it's incumbent upon us to look at the grieving families, to look at the families who don't know what to do, and look at them in eyes of love and say, hey, this is lay it all out. This is what is happening. This is where we're going to be. These are the steps that you need to consider. And I think if you reason with them, they'll be able to understand and make the right choices. He also restates what John Paul restates what he has said on many occasions. I would like to particularly underline how the administration of food and water, even when provided by artificial means, always represents a natural means of preserving life, not a medical act. Its use, therefore, should be considered in principle ordinary and proportionate, and as such morally obligatory, insofar as and until it is seen to have attained its proper finality, which is in the present case consists of providing nourishment to the patient and alleviation of his sufferings. Now, he's leading us to now some of the things we're going to talk about a little bit down the road in this conversation. There are going to be times when we can legitimately say, let death happen. And we'll outline them as we go along. He also stresses the commonly used notion of quality of life, and he sees it as a subjective assessment of the capabilities or lack thereof of a person that cannot take precedence over objective general principles. I tell my students all the time, and they always look at me as if I had 3 or 4 heads, that I really don't want to hear them in class talk about quality of life. And they'll say, well, Professor Boza, why? And I'll say, well, because your quality of life may be different than your quality of life, which is different than my quality of life. It's so very subjective. We don't know. I tell them that it'd be much better to talk about this person's flourishing. Is this person flourishing to the extent that this person can? And I give him an example of my 52-year-old cousin with Down syndrome who can't do what I do, can't do what you do, but he's having a ball. He works, in a supermarket doing some menial jobs, and he has his friends. He goes out, he lives with his sister and their families, and he's just as happy as they come. As far as I could see, he's got a great quality of life. It's not mine, but it doesn't have to be. So I would really encourage you to start to think through a better term to express what you are trying to say when you use that term, quality of life. I would like to cite a very telling and prophetic statement from this allocution. No evaluation of costs can outweigh the value of the fundamental good which we are trying to protect, that of human life. Moreover, to admit that decisions regarding a man's life can be based on the external acknowledgement of its quality is the same as acknowledging that increasing and decreasing levels of quality of life, therefore of human dignity, can be attributed from the external perspective to any subject, thus introducing into social relations a discriminatory and eugenic principle. Now, I want to highlight this by looking at one of the bioethicists that work at the Hastings Center. Now, Daniel Callahan is really a Catholic in name only sometimes. I wouldn't necessarily look to him as someone that I would want to seek good, authentic Catholic advice, nor would I see that at the Hastings Center. However, he warned in 1983, and very rightly so, that many of his colleagues favored broad policies for the withdrawing feeding tubes, not because of the burdens involved with such feedings, but because of a denial of nutrition may, in the long run, become the only effective way to make certain that a large number of biologically tenacious patients actually die. Now, he needs a lot of kudos for that because we're seeing this happen today. Why should we spend this money when this person's only going to die in a little while? Why should we continue to feed Terry Schiavo when all she's going to do is sit in this bed and cost us money? But the Schiavo case was a little different. I know Bobby Schindler, her brother. We've gotten to be very good friends, and he told me one time that his motivations, Michael Schiavo's motivations, was purely insurance money. Purely insurance money. And the media portrayal of that never showed, because there's this culture of death out there that we have to be aware of, which we are aware of, and to help ourselves kind of embrace the richness of Catholic teaching and to be that light and that leaven. I remember a phrase from Lumen Gentium, the Second Vatican Council document on the church, that said, "The church is to the world what the soul is to the body." So what is the soul to the body? We already talked to that. It's the animating force. Well, the church is the animating force, or ought to be, in the culture. And this is where we start, in times and forums like this. So, persistent voices to the contrary. The Consortium of Jesuit Bioethic Programs has been a leading voice in the opposition to St. John Paul's allocution on nutrition and hydration. While they strongly affirm his stance that all of human life deserves respect and that healthcare workers should not unilaterally deny patients treatments based on their own moral judgments of the quality of life, they take issue with his claim that ANH always represents a natural means of preserving life, not a medical... Wrong slide, sorry. There you go. Am I right? No? All right, well, we're just going to have to go that way for now. And then we'll catch up, I suppose. Okay. I know where we're going to be. So they object to the idea that ANH always represents a natural means of preserving life, not a medical act. They state that some theologians claim that this represents a departure from long-standing Catholic bioethical tradition. One of these theologians, Father Kevin O'Rourke, who is a Dominican, and many other Catholic bioethicists have used Pius XII's statement of the necessity to strive for spiritual ends to justify the removal of nutrition and hydration. He states that they maintain that that human life in a condition bereft of cognitive effects is not a great benefit for either the patient or the family or the community. They base their opinion on the premise that a person in this condition is no longer able to strive for the spiritual purposes of life. In this statement, he's referring to Pius XII's address to anesthesiologists. However, the CDF has made it clear that in this document, the Holy Father was referring only to respiration and not to nutrition. Now, you got to remember, in the 50s, we didn't have the capability of providing artificial nutrition and hydration. And so we were moving in that direction of respiration, and that's what Pius XII was addressing. If a person does not have the ability nor the potency to perform human acts, now or in the future, when that person can no longer strive for the purpose of human life and does not benefit the person in this condition to have life prolonged, he concludes that there is no moral obligation to prolong life of persons in the vegetative state, from which they will most likely not recover. And thus, the caregivers need not arrange for feeding and nutrition of patients. This paves way for the greatest piece of confusion that we have now in 2017 and a little bit before in terms of ordinary and extraordinary care, in terms of ordinary or proportionate care. Because what we've been saying and what we have defined early on in this discussion was that ordinary care offers reasonable hope of benefit. It says nothing about reasonable hope of recovery. So what you will see, and I've seen it in the medical statements of some of our Catholic hospitals in the Archdiocese, where they will point to reasonable hope of recovery. It's out there. People are seeing that. And so now, what's a family to do when they're looking at statements saying, well, my father's not going to be recovering from this, so therefore I don't have to feed him? Well, they're looking at wrong statements. The correct statement is reasonable hope of benefit, which means that, yes, we could feed Dad. He'll benefit from it somehow. He's not going to recover, but that's just the way life is right now. So we have to be extremely careful about the use of these two terms. And when you see reasonable hope of recovery, it is wrong. And I encourage you to make that statement to the people in charge. I encourage you. Because this is doing nothing to help our families make these very, very hard decisions for their loved ones. To address this, in 2007, the CDF further clarified the necessity of providing artificial nutrition and hydration to patients in a vegetative state. In the responses to certain questions of the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops concerning artificial nutrition and hydration, this document pointed to two very pointed questions were asked and answered. The first question, is the nutrition of the administration of food and water, whether by natural or artificial means, to a patient in a vegetative state, is it morally obligatory? Morally obligatory except when they cannot be assimilated by the patient's body or cannot be administered to the patient without causing significant physical discomfort? The response was yes. The administration of food and water, even by artificial means, is in principle ordinary and proportionate means of preserving life. It is therefore obligatory to the extent to which, and for as long as, it is shown to accomplish its proper finality, which is the administration and nourishment, or the hydration and nourishment of the patient. In this way, suffering and death by starvation and dehydration are prevented. Second question. When nutrition and hydration are being supplied by artificial means to a patient in a permanent vegetative state, may they be discontinued when competent physicians judge with moral certainty that the patient will never recover consciousness? The answer was no. A patient in a permanent vegetative state is a person with fundamental human dignity and must therefore receive ordinary and proportionate care, which includes in principle the administration of water and food, even if by artificial means. And the accompanying Vatican commentary on this response listed 3 conditions when ANH may not be morally obligatory. 1, when it is impossible to provide. 2, when the patient may be unable to assimilate the food and liquids. And 3, when artificial nutrition and hydration may be excessively burdensome for the patient or may cause significant physical discomfort. For example, resulting from complications in the use of medical means employed. So I hope that this conversation or this presentation gives you some thoughts, things to be aware of, things to be cautious by, and gives you some ideas as to how we could shepherd a family to taking a look of, say, PEG tubes, or taking a look at, the gastric nasal gastric tube. That would be of help to their loved one and not a hindrance to their loved one. And really, it's just a matter of us being able to explain in a more effective way the issues that could arise when the person is not fed or when the person is fed. But most importantly, to clear up, I think, misconceptions. I'll take any questions. Yes?
So I'm assuming we're just talking about like enteral nutrition via the bowel, right? Like There's no requirement for using TPN or IV fluids or something like that if there's some kind of a necrotic bowel or an issue with feeding enterally.
Yeah, and that would really be examined through the lens of burdens. So we always have to look at the burdens of these procedures to see if it's going to be appropriate.
Okay. Wait, so sometimes would TPN be necessary? I'm just trying to get into, when you say artificial nutrition, does that include total parenteral nutrition as a possibility?
I would say so. Yes.
And, burdensome, would that include... Sorry about that. And burdensome, would that include a financial burden to the family?
Well, yeah. When you look at the benefits and burdens, and we go over that in the bioethics that we were talking about earlier, there are certain things that could be, they're very subjective. In today's times in this country, Medicaid and Medicare take care of a lot of this. And so you're not going to be spending a whole lot of money on artificial nutrition and hydration. But what happens to those countries that are not like ours and don't have the social safety nets that we do? Yeah, I mean, sometimes that could be very expensive. And then if it becomes very expensive, we're not called to bankrupt ourselves, to provide this type of care. So yeah, I mean, we have to look at the burdens based on where we live.
Thanks, Steve.
So a friend of mine says that placement of the PEG is extraordinary, use of the PEG is not. So if you don't place it, you don't have, if it's NG, it's different. But if it's a surgical procedure, he calls that extraordinary.
Well, I don't know what grounds he would use for that. I think it can be a parsing of words, which happens a lot in this business.
He says it's a surgical procedure, and because it's a surgical procedure, I know it's not complicated.
No.
Unless, like in my mom's case, it was terribly with a hilar hernia and a bad heart and everything else, So
well, see, they're getting that from the consortium that we just spoke of, because they tend to see, and a lot of people tend to see, that it's not ordinary care; it's a medical procedure. And if we're looking at a medical procedure, well, then it runs under different rules, and that's not the spirit of what John Paul's trying to say, or what we're trying to say. Just like anything else, so you would look at the benefits and burdens of placing that in. And physicians would know better than anybody else that I can't subject this particular patient to this, procedure. I mean, if that's the reality of this person, well, then that's the reality, and the physician would be able to tell that. But just to say randomly that it's a medical procedure and therefore it's not ordinary care is not correct.
Right, but does the day come when you can't get a doc to put one in? I mean, this is what happened in my mom's situation. Her medical stuff was really it was a hot mess, to say the least.
Right.
It was really complicated. But bad heart and the GI doc and the invasive doc and what was another specialty. They were all consulted. And they all said, nope, ain't touching her. Because they didn't want her to die within, so many. I mean, I don't know what their reasoning was. Maybe they thought it wasn't worth it. I don't know what they were thinking.
Well, if they're thinking that your mom would die with those procedures, well, they would have the competency to be able to tell that, and then that would really fall under the excessive burden place. But I wouldn't use that as a blanket rule. I mean, it would be something for your mom only.
Yeah.
And if they come to a reasonable conclusion and a correct conclusion that she's not going to make it through the surgery, well, then she's not.
Right, it's just different.
It's different. She's
but
not.
In the midst of it, though, I was kind of wondering, are we heading to the day when the docs say, no, ain't putting it in?
Yes, we are heading to that day. I'm sorry to say that, but I think we are. And that's where good values-driven medical practice and medical physicians could stand on what the truth is. You're going to have people out there. I mean, I've been fortunate to work with our boot camp. The CMA has, and I've given talks to some very, very. I am so pleased and proud of the new med students that come to our boot camp every year. A few of them are here. But you hear the horror stories from them, in school, where they would teach things contrary to what we would teach, and that's why we have the boot camp in the first place. So they're up against a lot. They're up against a lot. But guess what? The more we have forums like this, the more we form virtuous physicians, and physicians who really have a heart not only for medicine, but for the gospel message. That'll change. That will change. But yeah, you're right. As it stands now, we're heading in that direction.
Right. Thanks.
There's a couple down there.
So I'm a relatively new member of the CMA, and this may already exist, but I've gone to 3 excellent presentations this afternoon, and on some controversial or difficult topics, the cell phone, neurological effects of cell phone, the gender identity in this topic. And does the CMA put out position statements? This is what the CMA, as a competent medical association, recommends regarding incorporating what the church has taught, because clearly there are different voices within the church saying different things. Yeah. The American Society of American Psychiatric Society is saying other than what I believe the CMA believes regarding gender issues, and it's great to say we should do this in our practices, but it would be very powerful to have these statements there from a competent medical society.
I do know that the CMA puts out statements. They put a great statement out that I was very interested in on the PULSE orders. You're familiar with those, right? The physician-authorized life-saving treatments. Their position paper was very, very good on that. And we do it for other issues as well. But I could tell you, too, the National Catholic Bioethics Center also puts out very, very good position papers. And they're not mutually exclusive. And I would recommend, not only being a member of the CMA, but to have a membership there, too, because you have access to their ethics and medics pamphlets that they put out once a month, and there's always good stuff coming out. They may not be the official statement of the NCBC, but they do also put official statements out. So I think you'll be well served to keep your eye open on both of these excellent organizations. Yes.
Thanks. My question is in regards to the very end of life. So frequently, I have patients, I'm sure many of us do, who are on hospice, and those last few days, they might not be responsive, and you get a sense, okay, they're approaching the end of their life. Literally putting an IV in somebody and giving them IV fluids, in general, is not a very extraordinary thing, in that a lot of times healthy women get an IV anytime they show face in a labor and delivery unit and might not need one. However, for our hospices, that's like a big no-go. You can't be on hospice, have IV fluids. Should we be pushing for our patients to have that in those last couple of moments of their life, in that sometimes we don't know how long they hang on for, and we do know if they were not at the end of their lives, they would need hydration over a theoretical 4-day period or
Well, the answer
3-day
should
period.
the answer should come from a good, competent medical doctor, because each patient's going to be different. Each end of life decision is going to be different depending on the person, and so you can't make a blanket statement that says we should be pushing for IV fluids in hospice care, because how do we know that that's not going to be? I mean, none of us would know unless we really had a relationship with the patient to know if this is going to be something that the body's going to be able to assimilate, or the body's not going to be able to assimilate, and then you have more problems because they're retaining all this fluid. So you really have to go case by case and use your best medical judgment as to whether that's right or it's wrong. Now, I'm sorry? Good.
That certainly makes a lot of sense. Thank you for that. I guess what I'm getting at, and I didn't word my question all that well, is you're right. There are definitely a lot of cases where there's fluid overload. This would not be a wise thing. But there are some cases where that's not present, but it would require rescinding hospice and a whole huge social rigmarole for the family that could be incredibly disruptive. And so, and some of those scenarios as a medical provider, you don't know if the body will be able to process the fluid unless you try it. You might try it for 15 minutes and say, okay, it's not working, stop it. But then that's stop hospice, start hospice, and it's, do we push for that?
It really depends on so much more. I mean, when I teach bioethics, we go through the ordinary and extraordinary in depth, but we also go in depth into what is fetal care. Now, we just said that artificial nutrition and hydration is not care, but we've also said there are times when we can, remove them if they're under, for the reasons that we talked about. And so you really have to make the best decision you can make in the instance with the patient that's right in front of you today. If you think, as the care person for this, that he or she's not going to have a problem retaining all this fluid that we put in there, if that's your honest opinion, well then, yeah. But if it means now taking a person who maybe only have 5 or 6 days to live or a month to live or what have you, well, this person may be in a process of dying and needs the hospice. And so it's going to call you to really be prudential as to what you decide, and then to consult with people who know better than we do. Look, I often have questions come to me either in class or in other forums where, Steve, what do you think about this, and how should we progress it, or what do you think we should do? And I'll have a good answer, but I'm not sure that this is the right answer. It seems right to me, so who do I go? I go to the National Catholic Bioethics Center. I'll pick up the phone and call Ted Furton and say, Ted, there's the scenario. This is, I don't tell him what I think because I want to know from him if I'm right. And so this is what's going on. How would you assess this? Sometimes he agrees with me, and sometimes he doesn't. So that's what I'm saying to you. You need to give your best practical response to the situation at hand, and if you don't know, take the step to call somebody else. And I would highly recommend calling the NCBC for a consult, because they'll give you the best answer. And look, that's all God calls us to do. He calls us to make the best choice at the best time. Informed. Good.
I've wrestled with that very question in my hospice patients, and the ethical religious directives expand on that piece a little bit. And I think the language that they use specifically is nearing death, actively dying, in the process of dying, so that nutrition or hydration does not offer reasonable hope of prolonging life. And so it's very helpful language for those cases, because you just don't quite know, and I found those helpful, the ERDs. Yeah.
While I certainly agree that there are many instances where a patient may be dying, obtunded, having hours or days to live, and really may not benefit from fluids, I would also make a case for IV fluids as a comfort measure. There are patients who are alert and conscious who get dehydrated to death, and it's not a pleasant way to die. Thirst, as you all know, is a very potent stimulus. It's a very uncomfortable thing. And when you're conscious and you're being dehydrated, fluids are a comfort measure.
Thank you.
I just add a comment to that. Fluid hydration can also treat delirium at the end of life. Sometimes it can be very effective treatment for delirium.
Just 2 comments. Thanks for the presentation. First comment, in the nomenclature of ordinary, extraordinary, proportionate, disproportionate, I heard that the proportionate, disproportionate was introduced to help doctors or medical staff. Because sometimes when you mention ordinary, they might just think of blood transfusion and extraordinary as ventilator without going through like a moral evaluation. So there's sometimes a preference to use proportionate and disproportionate because the transfusion could be extraordinary and the ventilator could be ordinary.
And that also goes for other forms of end-of-life care. So if you have a person with a number of comorbidities and is at stage 4 cancer as well, and now the question is, do we give the chemotherapy or we don't? Well, the answer would rely on whether that's proportionate or disproportionate to his care. And so the person may not be dying of the cancer only. The person may have a very, very bad heart. And what do? You know, is you're putting this person through the trauma of chemotherapy. When I say worth it, I don't mean it the way it's going to sound, but do we do that and put him through all that and 2 or 3 months later die of a heart attack or a stroke? Well, that's a good way of kind of determining what's proportionate or disproportionate to his care. You know, sometimes the chemo, if not maybe most of the time, the chemo is proportionate to his care, but sometimes it's disproportionate because there are too many other things going wrong with him. And again, these aren't cut and dry answers. They're very subjective to the person, and we have to really use good prudential judgment. You know?
My second comment was, I was glad you mentioned cost as part of the decision-making process. In the ERDs, it mentions cost also, benefit, burden, and cost. And to remind us that I think we are here, but not only to think of, for example, the American context. If we are Catholic, it means universal. And many people, for example, I work in a developing world context, and cost is really the decider because the patients have to pay for everything. And many times, things you would not imagine, for example, a blood transfusion, would be too expensive for the family, and the person will die from that. So thank you for mentioning cost.
Welcome. Thank you.
I'll second that comment about the call to NCBC. They were super quick to get back to me, called them twice, and it was less for me than it was my 12 siblings who needed to know that taking my mom off a ventilator was ethical. So, and I had to call twice over a couple of days just to make sure that they didn't change their mind.
Yeah. Yeah. I could tell you when my mother died 8 years ago, my father, number one, was in denial. And I don't mean Egypt. But he really did ask me to help him, you know, in making some of these decisions. And I can remember a few things that I won't forget. The first question was whether or not we should put my mother on the DNR. Now, the facts of the case is that she had an extremely bad case, a bad heart, and she was in heart failure, and she had a very high temperature, which damaged some of her valves. And so, you know, my father wanted everything, and that's fine. He could have had everything for her. But then I woke up in the middle of the night in a cold sweat because she was on a full code. And all I could think of is bones breaking in the middle of the night and all this kind of stuff. I got up. It was 2 o'clock in the morning. I got up with my father's at 4:30 because he's always been up at 4:30 in the morning. So he says, "What are you doing here?" And I said, "Well, I got to tell you this. This is where Mom is, and this is what full code means, and this is what's going to happen if she has an episode in the middle of the night." "Well, I wouldn't want that." I said, "Well, you're going to have to let me go in there and put a DNR on her." Then I explained what that was. So we put the DNR on. And then the attending physician called me and said, "You guys need to be making some decisions here." And so my question was very pointed. And he said, I said, "Is she a case of futility?" And he says, "Well, I can make a case for that." I said, he didn't know who he was talking to. I said, "Yeah, I'm making a case for anything. I want to know yes or no. Futility or clinically, yes, clinically, no." He said, "No, there's a few other things that we can do." I said, "All right, well, we're going to stay status quo right now." And then we had another conversation down the road, and she was at a point of futility. And so I felt comfortable recommending to my father to take her off of life support. She had died within maybe 13 hours after that. It was very pleasant. It was very peaceful. And being an Italian, we do funerals very, very well. And I wasn't like broken up about it. And I'm thinking about this, and I was telling my wife, everybody else jumps in caskets, and I'm over here sitting like it's nothing. She goes, "Well, you don't think it's not nothing for you." But I realized, and after I thought about it and prayed about it, I didn't have that reaction because we did everything we knew to do. And we knew that we made the right decisions at the right time. And this is where, she was ready to go home to her father. And so the things that I learned in just dealing with my family is that we have to explain everything in the simplest of terms for people to understand what we're talking about. And if we do that properly, they'll understand us and they'll take the right course, And I also learned a very valuable lesson in that I was sure, I was confident that we made the right decisions. That means everything. That means everything. Right down there.
When my mother was on her deathbed, the only thing she was receiving was an IV saline solution. And I was very irate when hospice ordered that to be stopped when she only had a few hours to live anyway. And we were always told that the person should always be on some type of liquid. And so we fired hospice and told them to keep, and she only lived a few hours afterwards, but then we followed the rule that they should be on fluids. So I did not agree with that at all.
Well, if there are no more questions, thank you very much.